Hi Josh, so take me through, what is a compulsory transfer provision?
Well, most private companies, but especially those at the early stages of their growth, shareholders typically tend to either be working in the business or they're investors, and frankly, if they're not one of those two things, there isn't really room for them on the cap table. So for those who aren't investors, their continued right to hold shares tends to be tied to their continued employment by the business. So effectively, the compulsory transfer is what it says on the tin, and if you cease to be an employee or a consultant or otherwise engaged by that company, then you must offer up your shares for sale to either to your fellow shareholders or to the company to be bought back and cancelled.
So what is vesting, and how does that fit into the compulsory transfer mechanic?
So when somebody becomes a compulsory transferee, commonly a leaver in sort of typical parlance in these transactions, the price that they're entitled to receive for their shares is dictated by the circumstances in which they become a leaver. So people hear good and bad leaver used as terms. A good leaver generally is somebody who leaves in a scenario which isn't their fault. So death, serious illness, and retirement at kind of normal retirement age tend to be the categories that give somebody good leaver status, and they will generally be entitled to market value of their shares at the relevant time, whatever that might be. A bad leaver is somebody who leaves in circumstances in which they're some way culpable, and that covers a range of scenarios from simple resignation to sort of the proverbial fingers in the till, or they've carried out some sort of fraud against the company and they've had their employment summarily terminated. They might be broken down between those levels of culpability. So sometimes you see intermediate leavers and very bad leavers, but broadly those are the categories that you use. Vesting adds another sort of element of complexity to that, and that usually applies to good leavers. So in early stage companies where every bit of value on the cap table is very important, it's normal to apply a vesting schedule to people's shares so that even if they become a good leaver, they're not entitled to their full value until such time as their shares have been fully vested. And we normally expect to see a vesting period of between sort of 2 and 5 years, with sort of 4 years being the sort of sector norm that people seem to be settling on. Generally, but not always, being fully vested doesn't entitle somebody to keep their shares. It just determines the price that they get for them. So in a good leaver scenario where vesting applies, we normally expect to see somebody getting market value for their vested shares, and either the issue price or £1 for the unvested shares. So as time goes by, they effectively accrue value. And this is all to do with incentivization and keeping sort of those shareholders who are actively involved in the business aligned with the needs of the wider shareholder group and the investors' objectives to drive value and increase growth in the company.
Thank you. So you've just answered my next question, then, which was going to be what's the rationale of including them. So thank you for that. Next question then, what are the pitfalls that someone should be aware of when they're negotiating these provisions?
As a founder, obviously your goal is just to hold on to your equity, and you want to reduce the scope of these as much as possible. It's very rare that some element of compulsory transfer isn't included in a VC investment. So as a founder, you would be looking to narrow down the scope of scenarios that result in you having to give your shares up at a penalty, effectively. So you really want the good leaver scenario to be the default position, and the bad leaver scenario to be confined to a specified list of events, preferably ones which you can control. So we would want to see, acting for a founder, you'd want to see bad leaver limited to gross misconduct, fraud, and commonly breach of restrictive covenant, which are all matters within that sort of individual's control and sort of don't typically happen by accident. I think the other trap that founders and sort of early shareholders in companies receiving investment tend to fall into is that people think of leaver provisions as sort of slightly scary and punitive, and people's first thought when reading them in a term sheet or in the long form documents is that they're going to have their shares taken away from them, which is kind of not unjustified. But stepping back, I think the message for founders is, or especially founders who are part of founder teams, they need to think about if it were one of the other team members in that scenario, and actually it's just as important to them to know that everybody's pulling in the same direction, everybody's incentivized to grow the business, and they can't just take value off the table, but cease to work in the business, because alignment at the early stage is very important.
Thanks, Josh. That's great. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Hannah.